Hello, Jake.
Hey, Rafi, good to see you.
You too. Today we are doing a video that is solely about base set. So base set in
Yes.
English, the first set that was printed in English, that had different versions that we'll get into. The typical base set, but there was a first edition, shadowless, which is kind of an in-between. And so I guess just to start us off, I'm curious, what was the first base set card that you ever got?
Let me think. So the first base set hollow that I pulled from a pack was the Zapdos, and amazingly, it ended up being a shadowless card, which I didn't know at the time. I had no idea about shadowless and first edition, when I was a kid. And so the first ever hollow I pulled was a Zapdos, and I remembered I pulled it at a birthday party. I remember exactly, like, vividly where it was and the feeling that I experienced when I pulled that card. But it was so exciting. And unfortunately, the arcade where I bought that card is now closed, which is very sad. I can't go back to there. But yeah, so that was my first hollow pull and was so exciting as a kid. How about you?
My first pack ever had a holo, and it was a Raichu. And I remember I knew nothing about Pokemon. My family just moved back from abroad, as I had mentioned in a previous video. And I was like, this is so cool. It's shiny. But I was kind of confused. I was like, I thought Pikachu was the most important Pokemon. And I was like, why is like Raichu better than Pikachu? Why isn't there a Pikachu holo? And to this day, I'm honestly still a little bit confused about that. So let's get into it. Tell me, what is the difference between the first edition print run and shadowless cards?
So like visually, so I brought over some examples that we can look at together, but visually, here's a first edition. Speaking of the card that you pulled.
Oh, nice. I didn't know that's one you were going to show.
Here's a first edition Raichu. And you can see the easiest way to tell if something's first edition is to look at that first edition stamp, which you can see right there, that little classic first edition stamp. And you see this in this set, and then also in the other English sets up to the E series in the first edition runs. And what makes a card shadowless, so the first edition cards are shadowless also. And if you look at the other side, there is no shadow there. On the unlimited cards, there is a shadow there. And so the difference between first edition and the shadowless is that the shadowless doesn't have that first edition stamp, but still has that shadowless border. There's also a date difference at the bottom, not between first edition and shadowless, but between first edition and shadowless each have a 1999 at the end of the date runs down here, and unlimited doesn't. So if you're looking at your cards and you're trying to figure out what do I have, first edition, shadowless, unlimited, those are the ways to differentiate those three things.
I've also noticed, I think at the top, between shadowless and the regular unlimited, the text of the HP is like thinner. It's like a thinner font.
Yes.
That's the way that I usually tell. But my impression from perusing eBay over time is that people get this mixed up all the time. Even people who are auctioning off super high value cards, they'll call something shadowless when it's unlimited. They'll call something first edition when it's shadowless. People will say first edition shadowless, which I guess is technically accurate. But I think I've learned the only way to get accurate information is just look at the actual picture of the card and figure it out for yourself. Because even the sellers who sell like high value cards, they get it wrong all the time.
Yeah. And why we say first edition and shadowless on this set is because if you see other, like here's a fossil card not shadowless. So as you can see here, does not have that shadow. Or sorry,
right,
it has
a shadow. So base set was the only set that had a non first edition shadowless card or anything shadowless. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me about like the difference in prices. Is shadowless without the first edition stamp more valuable, or is first edition still the most valuable?
So first edition is definitely still the most valuable. There isn't any shadowless card that's more valuable right now, or that people are paying more right now than the first edition examples of that same card. Yeah.
Is one of them, like, are first editions also rare? Do you know like how many first edition versus shadowless cards were printed?
So we don't know the answer to that. if you look at the population reports to try and get an idea of how many of these things have been graded, which can give us some idea of how many of these cards there are. There's actually more first edition examples in the pop reports. If you take we could take Alakazam, which is the first card in the set.
Yeah, let me pull that up.
And so for this card, there are, for example, there's something like 971.
Oh, let's see how right you are.
First edition holos. So if you were to add them all up, and that I'm saying across the whole population, and there's about 150 less shadowless across the whole population. Now that doesn't mean that there are more shadowless cards than there are first edition, because shadowless is a lower price point. There's less incentive to grade shadowless cards. And so for the lower pops, they're going to be generally more first edition on those lower end, because everyone is great. So even if you find like a PSA 5, Alakazam first edition, it's probably worth grading, versus if you find sort of a low end shadowless card, it's probably not worth grading yet. Although now that prices have been rising, it'll be interesting to track this over time, because both shadowless and first edition are rising. Now that the shadowless is rising and getting to those higher price points, it provides more incentive for more of that, for more people to grade their sort of less minty shadowless cards. So we should keep an eye on that. And over time, maybe hopefully, 10 years, also when more and more product is sort of opened and there's less and less of it, we'll have more of a exact numbers, maybe on more of an understanding of exactly how many of these cards. I think of them as about the same, probably. Maybe a little less first edition, but it's really hard to tell.
And can you tell from, obviously from a booster box or a pack, you can tell if it's first edition because it has a stamp. But could you tell if it was just shadowless from the pack or the box?
So you can, but not 100% sure. So there are different things, and there are really good videos that go over this specifically. Like TCA Gaming has a great YouTube channel where he goes over the very specific. So it has to do with the country codes on the bottom. It has to do with what color wing the Charizard has, and then you can look into the box a little bit without destroying it, and you can see the packs, and you can take a look to see what's going on with the pack. So I don't have one actually right here, but the first edition pack obviously has that first edition symbol. The shadowless pack has a similar makeup of it. There are a few details of it. I won't go into that right now, but there are a few details of it.
But basically, theoretically, you can tell. So it's not necessarily that shadowless feels more like a chase thing, because it's just total mystery. You could open up a pack and surprise it's shadowless, like your first experience with Zapdos. So
it definitely is more of a mystery with shadowless. With a first edition, you see that first edition symbol, it's first edition. With shadowless, there's never that sure thing. So there is that feeling of I'm pretty sure this is shadowless. I'm going to open it up, and then oh, it's shadowless. That excitement versus oh my gosh, it isn't. That's also part of why a lot of these things are not opened up, for the fear that they're not shadowless. And then you have now opened what you could have sold as a potential shadowless, booster pack that is now we know unlimited, and you would have lost a lot of money in that.
Right. And how about on the PSA, the actual tab at the top that describes the card? I've been curious about that ever since you told me, that there are some of those early cards, the top Sun ones, where the PSA label won't tell you something about the card, it was a misprint in this way, or it was missing the symbol. So does PSA tell you if it's shadowless or no?
PSA does tell you if it's shadowless. It differentiates between that first edition and that shadowless. Yeah.
Okay.
It does. And that actually was not always the case. And so I do have I don't have an example right here, but I do in my collection have shadowless cards that were not graded shadowless, that were graded just normal unlimited base.
And does that in of itself make it more of a valuable item? If people have these mistakes by PSA or things that before PSA implemented the differences, would people oh, I want that slab, or they'd be you should just crack it open, get it regraded as shadowless?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know of anyone that collects incorrect PSA slabs, my guess would be that would be like more of a negative than a positive for most, because most collectors would like to see their card, you know, correct, and would like to see that shadowless rather than the not shadowless. But there's niches for everything in this hobby, and there might be people out there who are looking for those and kind of want to collect those because they think it's cool that PSA made those mistakes. I think more often than not, you're interested in errors on the Pokemon cards themselves than errors that the third-party grading company has made.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Would be the logic there, I think.
So in your collection or your current sort of like buying or investing habits, like what are you going for? Are you looking for first editions, shadowless, or just unlimited?
So when I got into the hobby about 2.5, 3 years ago, I guess first as a collector. So as a collector, like I really like first edition and I really like shadowless. And honestly, like I probably have a slightly more affinity for first edition, but not like an extreme amount. Because to me, I see that shadowless card, it's still so exciting. It still feels so rare. Because I just remember when I started learning about them and started seeing some of those shadowless cards and realized I had a shadowless Zapdos and those sorts of things, like that excitement. And so I think it falls in this super weird place in the hobby because there's nothing else quite like it. You know, if we look at Magic the Gathering and we talk about like alpha, beta, and compare that to first edition shadowless, I've heard people in the hobby think about it like that. I think that's interesting, and I think it is one way to think about it. You know, the shadowless has this kind of interesting place as certainly more valuable than unlimited, certainly rarer, much rarer than unlimited, and a similar rarity to that first edition, but wasn't that very first printing. And people want the first usually and pay more for that first, but it's really carved itself, I think, into a valuable set in and of itself. And I think you're going to see that more and more in the future, particularly as first edition prices rise. Shadowless is always going to rise with first edition. Another interesting thing about shadowless is that shadowless actually has considerably lower PSA 10 populations. So it seems, based on the numbers, that shadowless is harder to grade
even than first edition.
First edition, yeah. And so why don't we pull up a few examples here?
Yeah.
So a good example, actually, you can actually look at any card because any card will follow this pattern. Mm-hmm. But you can see there are only 29. We could look at the Alakazam. There are 29 shadowless Alakazams.
So this is shadowless 29 and 83.
Yeah. To 83. Okay. So the difference in total population of these cards is much less significant than the difference in the PSA 10 in terms of percentage.
Right.
So like the PSA 10 here is like 2.5.
It's like less than 10% of the PSA 10s and 9s are 10.
But also if we think back to that, there were 700 and some odd, you know, of one, and, you know, there's a difference between about like, you know, a 25% difference or so between the population, or even a little bit less, like a 15% difference in the population overall. But there's a, you know, 2.5 times the amount of 10s to 9s. So thinking about it like that.
Yeah.
Which shows us that it's not just that there are less shadowless cards graded, it's also that particularly that PSA 10 is harder to get. My estimate.
That makes sense to me. I guess I'll also just point out, I guess, like we always talk about, there are different people and different personality types when it comes to all this. And so for me personally, like I don't really value even a first edition that much more. Like I remember thinking when I was a kid, like it's just a little stamp. You know, to me, like what made a Pokemon card special or desirable to me was either like the artwork, or, you know, if it was like playable in the game, you know, or had that like iconic memory of like the once upon a time it was playable, this was in my deck. But like the card itself, and just like having first edition or not, didn't matter that much to me. But I think it's nice that there's two parallel markets going, or in the case of base set 3, right? It's like I wouldn't be able to afford the premium on first edition, and I don't really care that much about it, right? But for collectors who really value it, or investors who have that hypothesis that collectors care about it and will go up, like it is available, or at least in the case of the first edition it is. Who knows with the shadowless, you know, PSA 10 Raichu.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about the value of these cards, it's really not targeting you and the way that you collect. And so I think for you, like you might be as happy with the unlimited, which is much, there are many, many more unlimited cards, like 10 times, you know, or 9 times, somewhere between 8 to 10 times probably the amount of unlimited cards than there are to these first edition and shadowless cards. And you get the, you know, roughly the same art. The The colors are the coloring's a little bit different on them. The shadow's different. There are a few variations depending on the card, but there's a good option, you know. But then for those top of the mountain people, those people who go after that chase, go after that rarity, like to feel like they have that really scarce item. I think these are both good investments and good buys. I invested more in the shadowless cards myself because I viewed the shadowless cards as, first of all, they were cheaper, and I didn't go heavy into base set in general because I think that base set was overvalued. I think that's less true now.
You told me about this hypothesis you had that makes a lot of sense to me, right? That it's like base set is pretty iconic for everyone. So even people who are dabbling in Pokemon, collecting or investing, right, will go after base set. But as this gets bigger, as it has been, especially over the last like 6 months, right, more and more people get into it. Base set is super expensive, prices people out, or the supply dries up. People turn to other sets, and that's why the other sets we talked about, like Jungle and Fossil, right, are going up too.
Yeah, I think too that when you compare base set to the amount of first editions there are in base set to the amount there are of those hollows in E series to the amount there are of those hollows in Neo to a lesser extent. E series is the most extreme. There are far fewer. Those items are rarer. Those items are likely rare. Excuse me. Right now there are less of them. Yeah, right now and the Neo sets. Right now there are less of them, and now because of the lower prices on those boxes. And those lower prices on those packs. Now the E series are interesting because they do have pretty high prices because of the scarcity of those packs, but lower, considerably lower than that first edition. Those might get open at a higher rate. There might be more of those left than the first edition boxes, and so there are more of those, PSA, high PSA potential graded cards in those packs. But right now, for example, if we want to look at that Alakazam. There are only 173 total Alakazams graded, hollow Alakazam graded in Skyridge versus the 971 in base set, first edition. So because of that, and I was seeing this pattern where all the experts and everyone was saying buy first edition. and so my feeling was like, well, why? Because we feel like it's the safest, we feel like it's the original, we feel like everyone wanted it. I think there was a fear that the other sets weren't going to follow and that the other sets were going to sort of like plateau. There wouldn't be enough collectors. There wouldn't be enough interest in these sorts of other things. I didn't feel that way. I felt like all of these things were going to have so much interest. And if you looked at the scarcity, the beauty of the art, and all these things in the Neo sets and also in these E-Series sets, those cards were much more undervalued, much more undervalued than base set because of those things. Now, base set is selling for about $150,000 for a complete one. The last one sold
a complete set of PSA.
A PSA 10 first edition, roughly. Now we saw it sold more closer to the 100,000, 110,000 range for a while. And during this price spike, we think it's jumped to maybe about 150,000, maybe a little less, somewhere in there though, right? So that's a big bump, okay? 50%, less than 50%, but all of the cards that I invested in Neo,
and so you're talking about like Neo sets and E-Series
all the
sets.
cards that I invested in Neo are up like 10 times within the same window.
10x, like 1,000%.
10x, not all of them, but a number of them. And the lowest ones are up 5 times. And the E-Series is starting to follow that same pattern. I bought a ton of E-Series because E-Series to me was insanely cheap. I was getting these cards for $50 each at PSA 10, and there were only 40 in the world. Some of them were only at 25 in the world. So I was getting them $50. And the pack cost you, there were 32 different hollows in each of these packs. And we can go more into this when we go specifically into E-Series. But the point being that when you looked at first edition, before this period, I was like way overvalued. Yes, definitely should be the most valuable set, is an awesome set. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I think this will always be the most expensive set in Pokemon, always be the most desired. I think that Charizard will always be it probably will always be the most expensive. There are a few cards that no, it will always be the most valuable set card, and will always drive that price. But When you talk about value and you talk about price point, would you rather have every PSA 10 first edition card of every card from between Jungle and the end of Neo, which would cost you about 150,000, or would you rather have all the PSA 10s in just that first edition base set? And if you had bought all of the PSA 10s, including all the shinings of all of those sets, you would have made much, much more money than if you had invested your money and bought the PSA 10. And that's just the reality of the numbers. Now, will that change? You hear a lot of experts right now talking about, okay, well, all of those have moved up, and they're a little frustrated because they had mostly base or a lot of base. They believe now that the base, I see a lot of forums and people talking about how the base set is undervalued. And until recently, you actually didn't really see any movement in base set while these other sets were moving up. Now you're starting to, as a result of those sets moving up, you're starting to see base set move up.
But you think it was a correction, right? So essentially, the base set was accurately valued, and all those other sets were undervalued, and now we're nearing the point of correction.
Yes, and base set has gone up a lot, and it should, and it's going to continue to go up a lot. I think that as long as Pokemon continues to thrive and more people come into the hobby, and more of these mid 20-year-old, 30-year-olds who grew up with it are going to come in, which you're definitely going to see, and you're going to see more of these. And you're going to see some percentage of these kids be interested in these sorts of sets. And as long as first edition base set always remains sort of that most important set, what started it all, and people have that connection, it's always going to be the most valuable, and it's always going to, and for a long time, it's going to continue to grow until there isn't more of that demand entering into the market with new people entering the market. So, so thinking it's not a bad investment to buy first edition base set. It's a very safe investment. It's a very good investment. It's better now, certainly, than it was a few months ago, I think. And I agree with people, but I would not expect to see the same 5 times in the next month. And if we do, that would be really amazing. That'd be really interesting because, first of all, they'd be so expensive to go 5 times up on the Charizard. You're talking $200,000 Charizards.
Right.
And there are 120 of them now or something. I'm not really sure. That's a lot of money for a card that has that much population, even though it's that first edition Charizard at this stage, when you compare it to the value of all of these other cards and the price point on all of these other cards. So we're always thinking of value. We're not thinking that if you bought that, it's never going to go over $200,000, that it's never going to go up. We're thinking about, I only have a certain amount of money. Where should I put that? All right.
Yeah. We'll get into that in the future videos, but thank you. This was enlightening once again. And yeah, we'll pick what to do next time.
All right. Thank you.
See you, Jake.
See you next time.